During the epoch which may be described as pre-scientific, men had no difficulty in finding an explanation of dreams. When they remembered a dream after waking up, they regarded it as either a favorable or a hostile manifestation by higher powers, demonic and divine. When modes of thought belonging to natural science began to flourish, all this ingenious mythology was transformed into psychology. And today only a small minority of educated people doubt that dreams are a product of the dreamer's own mind. Since the rejection of the mythological hypothesis, however, dreams have stood in need of explanation. The conditions of their origin, their relation to waking mental life, their dependence upon stimuli, which force their way upon perception during the state of sleep, the many peculiarities of their content which are repugnant to waking thought, the inconsistency between their ideational images and the affects attaching to them, and lastly their transitory character. The manner in which waking thought pushes them on one side as something alien to it and mutilates or extinguishes them in memory. All of these and other problems besides have been awaiting clarification for many hundreds of years. Until now, no satisfactory solution of them has been advanced. But what stands in the foreground of our interest is the question of the significance of dreams, a question which bears a double sense. It inquires in the first place as to the psychical significance of dreaming, as to the relation of dreams to other mental processes, and as to any biological function that they may have. In the second place, it seeks to discover whether dreams can be interpreted, whether the content of individual dreams has a meaning, such as we are accustomed to find in other psychical structures. In the assessment of the significance of dreams, three lines of thought can be distinguished. One of these, which echoes, as it were, the ancient overvaluation of dreams, is expressed in the writings of certain philosophers. They consider that the basis of dream life is a peculiar state of mental activity, and even go so far as to acclaim that state as an elevation to a higher level. For instance, Schubert declares that dreams are a liberation of the spirit from the power of external nature and a freeing of the soul from the bonds of the senses. Other thinkers, without going so far as this, insist nevertheless that dreams arise essentially from mental impulses and represent manifestations of mental forces which have been prevented from expanding freely during the daytime. A large number of observers agree in attributing to dream life a capacity for superior functioning, in certain departments at least, like in memory. In sharp contrast to this, the majority of medical writers adopt a view according to which dreams scarcely reach the level of being psychical phenomena at all. On their theory, the sole instigators of dreams are the sensory and somatic stimuli which either impinge upon the sleeper from outside or become active accidentally in his internal organs. What is dreamt, they contend, has no more claim to sense and meaning than, for instance, the sounds which would be produced if the 10 fingers of a man who knows nothing of music were wandering over the keys of a piano. Dreams are described by Binns as being no more than somatic processes, which are in every case useless and in many cases positively pathological. All the characteristics of dream life would thus be explained as being due to the disconnected activity of separate organs or groups of cells in an otherwise sleeping brain, an activity forced upon them by physiological stimuli. Popular opinion is but little affected by this scientific judgment, and is not concerned as to the sources of dreams. It seems to persist in the belief that nevertheless dreams have a meaning, which relates to the prediction of the future, and which can be discovered by some process of interpretation of a content, which is often confused and puzzling. The methods of interpretation employed consist in transforming the content of the dream as it is remembered, either by replacing it piecemeal in accordance with a fixed key, or by replacing the dream as a whole by another whole to which it stands in a symbolic relation. Serious-minded people smile at these efforts. Dreams are froth. One day I discovered to my great astonishment that the view of dreams which came nearest to the truth was not the medical but the popular one, half involved though it still was in superstition. for I had been led to fresh conclusions on the subject of dreams by applying to them a new method of psychological investigation, which had done excellent service in the solution of phobias, obsessions and delusions, etc. Since then, under the name of psychoanalysis, it has found acceptance by a whole school of research workers. The numerous analogies that exist between dream life and a great variety of conditions of psychical illness in waking life have indeed been correctly observed by many medical investigators. There seemed therefore good ground for hoping that a method of investigation which had given satisfactory results in the case of psychopathic structures would also be of use in throwing light upon dreams. Phobias and obsessions are as alien to normal consciousness as dreams are to waking consciousness. Their origin is as unknown to consciousness as that of dreams. In the case of these psychopathic structures, practical considerations led to an investigation of their origin and mode of development. For experience had shown that the discovery of the trains of thought which, concealed from consciousness, connect the pathological ideas with the remaining contents of the mind is equivalent to a resolution of the symptoms, and has as its consequence the mastering of ideas which till then could not be inhibited. Thus, psychotherapy was the starting point of the procedure of which I made use for the explanation of dreams. This procedure is easily described, although instruction and practice would be necessary before it could be put into effect. If we make use of it on someone else, let us say on a patient with a phobia, we require him to direct his attention onto the idea in question, not, however, to reflect upon it as he has done so often already, but to take notice of whatever occurs to his mind without any exception and report it to the physician. If he should then assert that his attention is unable to grasp anything at all, we dismiss this with an energetic assurance that a complete absence of any ideational subject matter is quite impossible. And in fact, very soon numerous ideas will occur to him and will lead on to others. But they will invariably be prefaced by a judgment on the part of the self-observer to the effect that they are senseless or unimportant, that they are irrelevant, and that they occurred to him by chance and without any connection with the topic under consideration. We perceive at once that it was this critical attitude which prevented the subject from reporting any of these ideas, and which indeed had previously prevented them from becoming conscious. If we can induce him to abandon his criticism of the ideas that occur to him, and to continue pursuing the trains of thought, which will emerge so long as he keeps his attention turned upon them, we find ourselves in possession of a quantity of psychical material, which we soon find is clearly connected with the pathological idea which was our starting point. This material will soon reveal connections between the pathological idea and other ideas, and will eventually enable us to replace the pathological idea by a new one, which fits into the nexus of thought in an intelligible fashion. This is not the place in which to give a detailed account of the premises upon which this experiment was based, or the consequences which follow from its invariable success. It will therefore be enough to say that we obtain material that enables us to resolve any pathological idea if we turn our attention precisely to those associations which are involuntary, which interfere with our reflection, and which are normally dismissed by our critical faculty as worthless rubbish. If we make use of this procedure upon ourselves, we can best assist the investigation by at once writing down what are at first unintelligible associations. I will now show what results follow if I apply this method of investigation to dreams. Any example of a dream should in fact be equally appropriate for the purpose, but for particular reasons I will choose some dream of my own, one which seems obscure and meaningless as I remember it, and one which has the advantage of brevity. A dream which I actually had last night will perhaps meet these requirements. Its content, as I noted it down immediately after waking up, was as follows. Company at table or table d'hôte. Spinach was being eaten. A woman was sitting beside me. She was turning her whole attention to me and laid her hand on my knee in an intimate manner. I removed her hand unresponsively. She then said, "But you've always had such beautiful eyes." I then had an indistinct picture of two eyes, as though it were a drawing or like the outline of a pair of spectacles. This was the whole of the dream, or at least all that I could remember of it. It seemed to me obscure and meaningless, but above all surprising. The woman is a person with whom I have hardly at any time been on friendly terms, nor, so far as I know, have I ever wished to have any closer relations with her. I have not seen her for a long time, and her name has not, I believe, been mentioned during the last few days. The dream process was not accompanied by affects of any kind. Reflecting over this dream brought me no nearer to understanding it. I determined, however, to set down without any premeditation or criticism the associations which presented themselves to my self-observation. As I have found, it is advisable for this purpose to divide a dream into its elements and to find the associations attaching to each of these fragments separately. Company at table or table d'hôte. This at once reminded me of an episode which occurred late yesterday evening. I came away from a small party in the company of a friend who offered to take a cab and drive me home in it. "I prefer taking a cab with a taximeter," he said. "It occupies one's mind so agreeably. One always has something to look at." When we had taken our places in the cab and the driver had set the dial so that the first charge of 60 hellers became visible, I carried the joke further. "We've only just got in," I said, "and already we owe him 60 hellers. A cab with a taximeter always reminds me of a table d'hôte. It makes me avaricious and selfish, because it keeps on reminding me of what I owe. My debt seems to be growing too fast, and I'm afraid of getting the worst of the bargain. And in just the same way at a table d'hôte, I can't avoid feeling in a comic way that I'm getting too little and must keep an eye on my own interests." I went on to quote somewhat discursively, "You make the poor man fall into debt." And now a second association to table d'hôte. A few weeks ago, while we were at table in a hotel at a mountain resort in the Tyrol, I was very much annoyed because I thought my wife was not being sufficiently reserved towards some people sitting near us, whose acquaintance I had no desire at all to make. I asked her to concern herself more with me than with these strangers. This was again as though I were getting the worst of the bargain at the table d'hôte. I was struck too by the contrast between my wife's behavior at table and that of the woman in the dream, who turned her whole attention to me. To proceed, I now saw that the events in the dream were a reproduction of a small episode of a precisely similar kind, which occurred between my wife and me at the time at which I was secretly courting her. The caress which she gave me under the tablecloth was her reply to a pressing love letter. In the dream, however, my wife was replaced by a comparative stranger, the woman from the previous dream. She is the daughter of a man to whom I was once in debt. I could not help noticing that this revealed an unsuspected connection between parts of the content of the dream and my associations. If one follows the train of association starting out from one element of a dream's content, one is soon brought back to another of its elements. My associations to the dream were bringing to light connections which were not visible in the dream itself. If a person expects one to keep an eye on his interests without any advantage to oneself, his artlessness is apt to provoke the scornful question, "Do you suppose I'm going to do this or that for the sake of your beautiful eyes?" That being so, the woman's speech in the dream, "You've always had such beautiful eyes," can only have meant, "People have always done everything for you for love. You have always had everything without paying for it." The truth is, of course, just the contrary. I have always paid dearly for whatever advantage I have had from other people. The fact that my friend took me home yesterday in a cab without my paying for it must after all have made an impression on me. Incidentally, the friend whose guests we were yesterday has often put me in his debt. Only recently I allowed an opportunity of repaying him to slip by. He has had only one present from me, an antique bowl, round which there are eyes painted, what is known as an occhiale, to avert the evil eye. Moreover, he is an eye surgeon. The same evening I asked him, after a woman patient, whom I had sent on to him for a consultation, to fit her with spectacles. As I now perceived, almost all the elements of the dream's content had been brought into the new context. For the sake of consistency, however, the further question might be asked of why spinach, of all things, was being served in the dream. The answer was that spinach reminded me of an episode which occurred not long ago at our family table, when one of the children, and precisely the one who really deserves to be admired for his beautiful eyes, refused to eat any spinach. I myself behaved in just the same way when I was a child. For a long time I detested spinach, till eventually my taste changed and promoted that vegetable into one of my favorite foods. My own early life and my child's were thus brought together by the mention of this dish. "You ought to be glad to have spinach," the little gourmet's mother exclaimed. "There are children who would be only too pleased to have spinach." Thus I was reminded of the duties of parents to their children. "You bring us into life, the poor man you let fall into guilt, then leave him to his pain. For all guilt is suffered for on earth." Goethe's words gained a fresh meaning in this connection. I will pause here to survey the results I had so far reached in my dream analysis. By following the associations which arose from the separate elements of the dream divorced from their context, I arrived at a number of thoughts and recollections which I could not fail to recognize as important products of my mental life. This material revealed by the analysis of the dream was intimately connected with the dream's content, yet the connection was of such a kind that I could never have inferred the fresh material from that content. The dream was unemotional, disconnected and unintelligible, but while I was producing the thoughts behind the dream, I was aware of intense and well-founded affective impulses. The thoughts themselves fell at once into logical chains, in which certain central ideas made their appearance more than once. Thus, the contrast between selfish and unselfish, and the elements being in debt and without paying for it, were central ideas of this kind, not represented in the dream itself. I might draw closer together the threads in the material revealed by the analysis, and I might then show that they converge upon a single nodal point, but considerations of a personal and not of a scientific nature prevent my doing so in public. I should be obliged to betray many things which had better remain my secret, for on my way to discovering the solution of the dream, all kinds of things were revealed which I was unwilling to admit even to myself. Why then, it will be asked, have I not chosen some other dream, whose analysis is better suited for reporting, so that I could produce more convincing evidence of the meaning and connectedness of the material uncovered by analysis? The answer is that every dream with which I might try to deal would lead to things equally hard to report and would impose an equal discretion upon me. Nor should I avoid this difficulty by bringing up someone else's dream for analysis, unless circumstances enabled me to drop all disguise without damage to the person who had confided in me. At the point which I have now reached, I am led to regard the dream as a sort of substitute for the thought processes, full of meaning and emotion, at which I arrived after the completion of the analysis. We do not yet know the nature of the process which has caused the dream to be generated from these thoughts, but we can see that it is wrong to regard it as purely physical and without psychical meaning, as a process which has arisen from the isolated activity of separate groups of brain cells aroused from sleep. Two other things are already clear. The content of the dream is very much shorter than the thoughts for which I regard it as a substitute. And analysis has revealed that the instigator of the dream was an unimportant event of the evening before I dreamt it. I should, of course, not draw such far-reaching conclusions if only a single dream analysis was at my disposal. If experience shows me, however, that by uncritically pursuing the associations arising from any dream, I can arrive at a similar train of thoughts, among the elements of which the constituents of the dream reappear, and which are interconnected in a rational and intelligible manner, then it will be safe to disregard the slight possibility that the connections observed in a first experiment might be due to chance. I think I am justified, therefore, in adopting a terminology which will crystallize our new discovery. In order to contrast the dream as it is retained in my memory with the relevant material discovered by analyzing it, I shall speak of the former as the manifest content of the dream, and the latter, without in the first instance making any further distinction, as the latent content of the dream. I am now faced by two new problems, which have not hitherto been formulated. What is the psychical process which has transformed the latent content of the dream into the manifest one which is known to me from my memory? What are the motive or motives which have necessitated this transformation? I shall describe the process which transforms the latent into the manifest content of dreams as the dream work. The counterpart to this activity, one which brings about a transformation in the opposite direction, is already known to us as the work of analysis. The remaining problems arising out of dreams, questions as to the instigators of dreams, as to the origin of their material, as to their possible meaning, as to the possible function of dreaming, and as to the reasons for dreams being forgotten. All these problems will be discussed by me on the basis not of the manifest, but of the newly discovered latent dream content. Since I attribute all the contradictory and incorrect views upon dream life which appear in the literature of the subject to ignorance of the latent content of dreams as revealed by analysis, I shall be at the greatest pains henceforward to avoid confusing the manifest dream with the latent dream thoughts. The transformation of the latent dream thoughts into the manifest dream content deserves all our attention, since it is the first instance known to us of psychical material being changed over from one mode of expression to another, from a mode of expression which is immediately intelligible to us, to another which we can only come to understand with the help of guidance and effort, though it too must be recognized as a function of our mental activity. Dreams can be divided into three categories, in respect of the relation between their latent and manifest content. In the first place, we may distinguish those dreams which make sense and are at the same time intelligible, which, that is to say, can be inserted without further difficulty into the context of our mental life. We have numbers of such dreams. They are for the most part short and appear to us in general to deserve little attention, since there is nothing astonishing or strange about them. Incidentally, their occurrence constitutes a powerful argument against the theory according to which dreams originate from the isolated activity of separate groups of brain cells. They give no indication of reduced or fragmentary psychical activity, but nevertheless we never question the fact of their being dreams and do not confuse them with the products of waking life. A second group is formed by those dreams which, though they are connected in themselves and have a clear sense, nevertheless have a bewildering effect because we cannot see how to fit that sense into our mental life. Such would be the case if we were to dream, for instance, that a relative of whom we were fond had died of the plague, when we had no reason for expecting, fearing, or assuming any such thing. We should ask in astonishment, how did I get hold of such an idea? The third group, finally, contains those dreams which are without either sense or intelligibility, which seem disconnected, confused, and meaningless. The preponderant majority of the products of our dreaming exhibit these characteristics, which are the basis of the low opinion in which dreams are held, and of the medical theory that they are the outcome of a restricted mental activity. The most evident signs of incoherence are seldom absent, especially in dream compositions of any considerable length and complexity. The contrast between the manifest and latent content of dreams is clearly of significance only for dreams of the second and more particularly of the third category. It is there that we are faced by riddles which only disappear after we have replaced the manifest dream by the latent thoughts behind it. And it was on a specimen of the last category, a confused and unintelligible dream, that the analysis which I have just recorded was carried out. Contrary to our expectation, however, we came up against motives which prevented us from becoming fully acquainted with the latent dream thoughts. A repetition of similar experiences may lead us to suspect that there is an intimate and regular relation between the unintelligible and confused nature of dreams and the difficulty of reporting the thoughts behind them. Before inquiring into the nature of this relation, we may with advantage turn our attention to the more easily intelligible dreams of the first category, in which the manifest and latent content coincide, and there appears to be a consequent saving in dream work. Moreover, an examination of these dreams offers advantages from another standpoint. For children's dreams are of that kind, significant and not puzzling. Here, incidentally, we have a further argument against tracing the origin of dreams to dissociated cerebral activity during sleep. For why should a reduction in psychical functioning of this kind be a characteristic of the state of sleep in the case of adults, but not in that of children? On the other hand, we shall be fully justified in expecting that an explanation of psychical processes in children, in whom they may well be greatly simplified, may turn out to be an indispensable prelude to the investigation of the psychology of adults. I will therefore record a few instances of dreams which I have collected from children. A little girl, 19 months old, had been kept without food all day because she had had an attack of vomiting in the morning. Her nurse declared that she had been upset by eating strawberries. During the night after this day of starvation, she was heard saying her own name in her sleep and adding, "Strawberries, wild strawberries, omelette, pudding." She was thus dreaming of eating a meal, and she laid special stress in her menu on the particular delicacy of which, as she had reason to expect, she would only be allowed scanty quantities in the near future. A little boy of 22 months had a similar dream of a feast which he had been denied. The day before, he had been obliged to present his uncle with a gift of a basket of fresh cherries, of which he himself, of course, had only been allowed to taste a single sample. He awoke with this cheerful news: "Herman eaten all the chewies." One day, a girl of 3¼ made a trip across a lake. The voyage was evidently not long enough for her, for she cried when she had to get off the boat. Next morning, she reported that during the night she had been for a trip on the lake. She had been continuing her interrupted voyage. A boy of 5¼ showed signs of dissatisfaction in the course of a walk in the neighborhood of the Dachstein. Each time a new mountain came into view, he asked if it was the Dachstein, and finally refused to visit a waterfall with the rest of the company. His behavior was attributed to fatigue, but it found a better explanation when next morning he reported that he had dreamt that he had climbed up the Dachstein. He had evidently had the idea that the expedition would end in a climb up the Dachstein and had become depressed when the promised mountain never came in view. He made up in his dream for what the previous day had failed to give him. A 6-year-old girl had an exactly similar dream. In the course of a walk, her father had stopped short of their intended goal as the hour was getting late. On their way back, she had noticed a signpost bearing the name of another landmark, and her father had promised to take her there as well, another time. Next morning, she met her father with the news that she had dreamt that he had been with her to both places. The common element in all these children's dreams is obvious. All of them fulfilled wishes which were active during the day but had remained unfulfilled. The dreams were simple and undisguised wish fulfillments. Here is another child's dream, which, though at first sight it is not quite easy to understand, is also nothing more than a wish fulfillment. A little girl not quite 4 years old had been brought to town from the country because she was suffering from an attack of poliomyelitis. She spent the night with an aunt who had no children and was put to sleep in a large bed, much too large for her, of course. Next morning, she said she had had a dream that the bed had been far too small for her and that there had been no room for her in it. It is easy to recognize this dream as a wishful dream if we remember that children very often express a wish to be big. The size of the bed was a disagreeable reminder of her smallness to the would-be big child. She therefore corrected the unwelcome relation in her dream and grew so big that even the large bed was too small for her. Even when the content of children's dreams becomes complicated and subtle, there is never any difficulty in recognizing them as wish fulfillments. An 8-year-old boy had a dream that he was driving in a chariot with Achilles and that Diomede was the charioteer. It was shown that the day before he had been deep in a book of legends about the Greek heroes, and it was easy to see that he had taken the heroes as his models and was sorry not to be living in their days. This small collection throws a direct light on a further characteristic of children's dreams, their connection with daytime life. The wishes which are fulfilled in them are carried over from daytime, and as a rule from the day before, and in waking life they have been accompanied by intense emotion. Nothing unimportant or indifferent, or nothing which would strike a child as such, finds its way into the content of their dreams. Numerous examples of dreams of this infantile type can be found occurring in adults as well, though, as I have said, they are usually brief in content. Thus, a number of people regularly respond to a stimulus of thirst during the night with dreams of drinking, which thus endeavor to get rid of the stimulus and enable sleep to continue. In some people, dreams of convenience of this kind often occur before waking, when the necessity for getting up presents itself. They dream that they are already up and at the washing stand, or that they are already at the school or office where they are due at some particular time. During the night before a journey, we not infrequently dream of having arrived at our destination. So too, before a visit to the theatre or a party, a dream will often anticipate the pleasure that lies ahead, out of impatience, as it were. In other dreams, the wish fulfillment is expressed a stage more indirectly. Some connection or implication must be established. That is, the work of interpretation must be begun before the wish fulfillment can be recognized. A man told me, for instance, that his young wife had had a dream that her period had started. I reflected that if this young woman had missed her period, she must have known that she was faced with a pregnancy. Thus, when she reported her dream, she was announcing her pregnancy, and the meaning of the dream was to represent as fulfilled her wish that the pregnancy might be postponed for a while. Under unusual or extreme conditions, dreams of this infantile character are particularly common. Thus, the leader of a polar expedition has recorded that the members of his expedition, while they were wintering in the ice field and living on a monotonous diet and short rations, regularly dreamt like children of large meals, of mountains of tobacco, and of being back at home. It by no means rarely happens that in the course of a comparatively long, complicated, and on the whole confused dream, one particularly clear portion stands out which contains an unmistakable wish fulfillment, but which is bound up with some other, unintelligible material. But in the case of adults, anyone with some experience in analyzing their dreams will find to his surprise that even those dreams which have an appearance of being transparently clear are seldom as simple as those of children, and that behind the obvious wish fulfillment some other meaning may lie concealed. It would indeed be a simple and satisfactory solution of the riddle of dreams if the work of analysis were to enable us to trace even the meaningless and confused dreams of adults back to the infantile type of fulfillment of an intensely felt wish of the previous day. There can be no doubt, however, that appearances do not speak in favor of such an expectation. Dreams are usually full of the most indifferent and strangest material, and there is no sign in their content of the fulfillment of any wish. But before taking leave of infantile dreams with their undisguised wish fulfillments, I must not omit to mention one principal feature of dreams, which has long been evident and which emerges particularly clearly precisely in this group. Every one of these dreams can be replaced by an optative clause. Oh, if only the trip on the lake had lasted longer. If only I were already washed and dressed. If only I could have kept the cherries instead of giving them to Uncle. But dreams give us more than such optative clauses. They show us the wish as already fulfilled. They represent its fulfillment as real and present, and the material employed in dream representation consists principally, though not exclusively, of situations and of sensory images, mostly of a visual character. Thus, even in this infantile group, a species of transformation, which deserves to be described as dream work, is not completely absent. A thought expressed in the optative has been replaced by a representation in the present tense. We shall be inclined to suppose that a transformation of some such kind has occurred even in confused dreams, though we cannot tell whether what has been transformed was an optative in their case too. There are, however, two passages in the specimen dream which I have reported, and with whose analysis we have made some headway, that give us reason to suspect something of the kind. The analysis showed that my wife had concerned herself with some other people at table, and that I had found this disagreeable. The dream contained precisely the opposite of this. The person who took the place of my wife was turning her whole attention to me. But a disagreeable experience can give rise to no more suitable wish than that its opposite might have occurred, which was what the dream represented as fulfilled. There was an exactly similar relation between the bitter thought revealed in the analysis that I had never had anything free of cost, and the remark made by the woman in the dream, "You've always had such beautiful eyes." Some part of the opposition between the manifest and latent content of dreams is thus attributable to wish fulfillment. But another achievement of the dream work, tending as it does to produce incoherent dreams, is even more striking. If in any particular instance we compare the number of ideational elements or the space taken up in writing them down in the case of the dream and of the dream thoughts to which the analysis leads us, and of which traces are to be found in the dream itself, we shall be left in no doubt that the dream work has carried out a work of compression or condensation on a large scale. It is impossible at first to form any judgment of the degree of this condensation, but the deeper we plunge into a dream analysis, the more impressive it seems. From every element in a dream's content, associative threads branch out in two or more directions. Every situation in a dream seems to be put together out of two or more impressions or experiences. For instance, I once had a dream of a sort of swimming pool in which the bathers were scattering in all directions. At one point on the edge of the pool, someone was standing and bending towards one of the people bathing, as though to help her out of the water. The situation was put together from a memory of an experience I had had at puberty and from two paintings, one of which I had seen shortly before the dream. One was a picture from Schwinn's series illustrating the legend of Melusine, which showed the water nymphs surprised in their pool, the scattering bathers in the dream. The other was a picture of the deluge by an Italian master, while the little experience remembered from my puberty was of having seen the instructor at a swimming school helping a lady out of the water, who had stopped in until after the time set aside for men bathers. In the case of the example which I chose for interpretation, an analysis of the situation led me to a small series of recollections, each of which contributed something to the content of the dream. In the first place, there was the episode from the time of my engagement, of which I have already spoken. The pressure upon my hand under the table, which was a part of that episode, provided the dream with the detail under the table. A detail which I had to add as an afterthought to my memory of the dream. In the episode itself, there was of course no question of turning to me. The analysis showed that this element was the fulfillment of a wish by presenting the opposite of an actual event, and that it related to my wife's behavior at the table d'hôte. But behind this recent recollection, there lay concealed an exactly similar and far more important scene from the time of our engagement, which estranged us for a whole day. The intimate laying of a hand on my knee belonged to a quite different context and was concerned with quite other people. This element in the dream was in turn the starting point of two separate sets of memories, and so on. The material in the dream thoughts, which is packed together for the purpose of constructing a dream situation, must of course in itself be adaptable for that purpose. There must be one or more common elements in all the components. The dream work then proceeds just as Francis Galton did in constructing his family photographs. It superimposes, as it were, the different components upon one another. The common element in them then stands out clearly in the composite picture, while contradictory details more or less wipe one another out. This method of production also explains to some extent the varying degrees of characteristic vagueness shown by so many elements in the content of dreams. Basing itself on this discovery, dream interpretation has laid down the following rule. In analyzing a dream, if an uncertainty can be resolved into an either or, we must replace it for purposes of interpretation by an and take each of the apparent alternatives as an independent starting point for a series of associations. If a common element of this kind between the dream thoughts is not present, the dream work sets about creating one, so that it may be possible for the thoughts to be given a common representation in the dream. The most convenient way of bringing together two dream thoughts which, to start with, have nothing in common, is to alter the verbal form of one of them, and thus bring it halfway to meet the other, which may be similarly clothed in a new form of words. A parallel process is involved in hammering out a rhyme, where a similar sound has to be sought for in the same way as a common element is in our present case. A large part of the dream work consists in the creation of intermediate thoughts of this kind, which are often highly ingenious, though they frequently appear far-fetched. These then form a link between the composite picture in the manifest content of the dream and the dream thoughts, which are themselves diverse both in form and essence, and have been determined by the exciting factors of the dream. The analysis of our sample dream affords us an instance of this kind in which a thought has been given a new form in order to bring it into contact with another which is essentially foreign to it. In carrying out the analysis, I came upon the following thought. I should like to get something sometimes without paying for it. But in that form the thought could not be employed in the dream content. It was therefore given a fresh form. I should like to get some enjoyment without cost, kosten. Now the word kosten in its second sense fits into the table d'hôte circle of ideas, and could thus be represented in the spinach which was served in the dream. When a dish appears at our table and the children refuse it, their mother begins by trying persuasion, and urges them just to taste kosten a bit of it. It may seem strange that the dream work should make such free use of verbal ambiguity, but further experience will teach us that the occurrence is quite a common one. The process of condensation further explains certain constituents of the content of dreams which are peculiar to them and are not found in waking ideation. What I have in mind are collective and composite figures and the strange composite structures, which are creations not unlike the composite animals invented by the folk imagination of the Orient. The latter, however, have already assumed stereotyped shapes in our thought, whereas in dreams, fresh composite forms are being perpetually constructed in an inexhaustible variety. We are all of us familiar with such structures from our own dreams. There are many sorts of ways in which figures of this kind can be put together. I may build up a figure by giving it the features of two people, or I may give it the form of one person, but think of it in the dream as having the name of another person. Or I may have a visual picture of one person, but put it in a situation which is appropriate to another. In all these cases, the combination of different persons into a single representative in the content of the dream has a meaning. It is intended to indicate an and or just as, or to compare the original persons with each other in some particular respect, which may even be specified in the dream itself. As a rule, however, this common element between the combined persons can only be discovered by analysis and is only indicated in the contents of the dream by the formation of the collective figure. The composite structures which occur in dreams in such immense numbers are put together in an equal variety of ways, and the same rules apply to their resolution. There is no need for me to quote any instances. Their strangeness disappears completely when once we have made up our minds not to class them with the objects of our waking perception, but to remember that they are products of dream condensation and are emphasizing in an effectively abbreviated form some common characteristic of the objects which they are thus combining. Here again the common element has as a rule to be discovered by analysis. The content of the dream merely says, as it were, all these things have an element X in common. The dissection of these composite structures by means of analysis is often the shortest way to finding the meaning of a dream. Thus, I dreamt on one occasion that I was sitting on a bench with one of my former university teachers, and that the bench, which was surrounded by other benches, was moving forward at a rapid pace. This was a combination of a lecture theatre and a trottoir roulant. I will not pursue this train of ideas further. Another time, I was sitting in a railway carriage and holding on my lap an object in the shape of a top hat, which however was made of transparent glass. The situation made me think at once of the proverb, "If you go hat in hand, you can cross the whole land." The glass cylinder led me by a short detour to think of an incandescent gas mantle, and I soon saw that I should like to make a discovery which would make me as rich and independent as my fellow countryman, Dr. Auer von Welsbach, was made by his, and that I should like to travel instead of stopping in Vienna. In the dream, I was traveling with my discovery, the hat in the shape of a glass cylinder, a discovery which, it is true, was not as yet of any great practical use. The dream work is particularly fond of representing two contrary ideas by the same composite structure. Thus, for instance, a woman had a dream in which she saw herself carrying a tall spray of flowers, such as the angel is represented as holding in pictures of the Annunciation. This stood for innocence. Incidentally, her own name was Maria. On the other hand, the spray was covered with large white flowers like camellias. This stood for the opposite of innocence. It was associated with the lady with the camellias. A good proportion of what we have learnt about condensation in dreams may be summarized in this formula. Each element in the content of a dream is overdetermined by material in the dream thoughts. It is not derived from a single element in the dream thoughts, but may be traced back to a whole number. These elements need not necessarily be closely related to each other in the dream thoughts themselves. They may belong to the most widely separated regions of the fabric of those thoughts. A dream element is, in the strictest sense of the word, the representative of all this disparate material in the content of the dream. But analysis reveals yet another side of the complicated relation between the content of the dream and the dream thoughts. Just as connections lead from each element of the dream to several dream thoughts, so as a rule a single dream thought is represented by more than one dream element. The threads of association do not simply converge from the dream thoughts to the dream content. They cross and interweave with each other many times over in the course of their journey. Condensation, together with the transformation of thoughts into situations, dramatization, is the most important and peculiar characteristic of the dream work. So far, however, nothing has transpired as to any motive necessitating this compression of the material. In the case of the complicated and confused dreams with which we are now concerned, condensation and dramatization alone are not enough to account for the whole of the impression that we gain of the dissimilarity between the content of the dream and the dream thoughts. We have evidence of the operation of a third factor, and this evidence deserves careful sifting. First and foremost, when by means of analysis we have arrived at a knowledge of the dream thoughts, we observe that the manifest dream content deals with quite different material from the latent thoughts. This, to be sure, is no more than an appearance which evaporates under closer examination, for we find ultimately that the whole of the dream content is derived from the dream thoughts, and that almost all the dream thoughts are represented in the dream content. Nevertheless, something of the distinction still remains. What stands out boldly and clearly in the dream, as its essential content must, after analysis, be satisfied with playing an extremely subordinate role among the dream thoughts, and what, on the evidence of our feelings, can claim to be the most prominent among the dream thoughts, is either not present at all as ideational material in the content of the dream, or is only remotely alluded to in some obscure region of it. We may put it in this way. In the course of the dream work, the psychical intensity passes over from the thoughts and ideas to which it properly belongs onto others, which in our judgment have no claim to any such emphasis. No other process contributes so much to concealing the meaning of a dream and to making the connection between the dream content and the dream thoughts unrecognizable. In the course of this process, which I shall describe as dream displacement, the psychical intensity, significance or effective potentiality of the thoughts is, as we further find, transformed into sensory vividness. We assume as a matter of course that the most distinct element in the manifest content of a dream is the most important one. But in fact, owing to the displacement that has occurred, it is often an indistinct element which turns out to be the most direct derivative of the essential dream thought. What I have called dream displacement might equally be described, in Nietzsche's phrase, as a transvaluation of psychical values. I shall not have given an exhaustive estimate of this phenomenon, however, unless I add that this work of displacement or transvaluation is performed to a very varying degree in different dreams. There are dreams which come about almost without any displacement. These are the ones which make sense and are intelligible, such, for instance, as those which we have recognized as undisguised wishful dreams. On the other hand, there are dreams in which not a single piece of the dream thoughts has retained its own psychical value, or in which everything that is essential in the dream thoughts has been replaced by something trivial. And we can find a complete series of transitional cases between these two extremes. The more obscure and confused a dream appears to be, the greater the share in its construction, which may be attributed to the factor of displacement. Our specimen dream exhibits displacement to this extent at least, that its content seems to have a different center from its dream thoughts. In the foreground of the dream content, a prominent place is taken by a situation in which a woman seems to be making advances to me. While in the dream thoughts, the chief emphasis is laid on a wish for once to enjoy unselfish love, love which costs nothing. An idea concealed behind the phrase about beautiful eyes and the far-fetched allusion to spinach. If we undo dream displacement by means of analysis, we obtain what seems to be completely trustworthy information on two much disputed problems concerning dreams, as to their instigators and as to their connection with waking life. There are dreams which immediately reveal their derivation from events of the day. There are others in which no trace of any such derivation is to be discovered. If we seek the help of analysis, we find that every dream, without any possible exception, goes back to an impression of the past few days. Or, it is probably more correct to say, of the day immediately preceding the dream, of the dream day. The impression which plays the part of dream instigator may be such an important one that we feel no surprise at being concerned with it in the daytime. And in that case, we rightly speak of the dream as carrying on with the significant interests of our waking life. As a rule, however, if a connection is to be found in the content of the dream with any impression of the previous day, that impression is so trivial, insignificant and unmemorable that it is only with difficulty that we ourselves can recall it. And in such cases, the content of the dream itself, even if it is connected and intelligible, seems to be concerned with the most indifferent trivialities, which would be unworthy of our interest if we were awake. A good deal of the contempt in which dreams are held is due to the preference thus shown in their content for what is indifferent and trivial. Analysis does away with the misleading appearance upon which this derogatory judgment is founded. If the content of a dream puts forward some indifferent impression as being its instigator, analysis invariably brings to light a significant experience, and one by which the dreamer has good reason to be stirred. This experience has been replaced by the indifferent one, with which it is connected by copious associative links. Where the content of the dream treats of insignificant and uninteresting ideational material, analysis uncovers the numerous associative paths connecting these trivialities with things that are of the highest psychical importance in the dreamer's estimation. If what make their way into the content of dreams are impressions and material which are indifferent and trivial rather than justifiably stirring and interesting, that is only the effect of the process of displacement. If we answer our questions about dream instigators and the connection between dreaming and daily affairs on the basis of the new insight we have gained from replacing the manifest by the latent content of dreams, we arrive at these conclusions. Dreams are never concerned with things which we should not think it worthwhile to be concerned with during the day, and trivialities which do not affect us during the day are unable to pursue us in our sleep. What was the dream instigator in the specimen that we have chosen for analysis? It was the definitely insignificant event of my friend giving me a drive in a cab free of cost. The situation in the dream at the table d'hôte contained an allusion to this insignificant precipitating cause, for in my conversation I had compared the taximeter cab with a table d'hôte. But I can also point to the important experience which was represented by this trivial one. A few days earlier I had paid out a considerable sum of money on behalf of a member of my family of whom I am fond. No wonder, said the dream thoughts, if this person were to feel grateful to me. Love of that sort would not be free of cost. Love that is free of cost, however, stood in the forefront of the dream thoughts. The fact that not long before I had had several cab drives with the relative in question made it possible for the cab drive with my friend to remind me of my connections with this other person. The indifferent impression which becomes a dream instigator owing to associations of this kind is subject to a further condition which does not apply to the true source of the dream. It must always be a recent impression derived from the dream day. I cannot leave the subject of dream displacement without drawing attention to a remarkable process which occurs in the formation of dreams and in which condensation and displacement combine to produce the result. In considering condensation, we have already seen the way in which two ideas in the dream thoughts, which have something in common, some point of contact, are replaced in the dream content by a composite idea, in which a relatively distinct nucleus represents what they have in common. while indistinct subordinate details correspond to the respects in which they differ from each other. If displacement takes place in addition to condensation, what is constructed is not a composite idea, but an intermediate common entity, which stands in a relation to the two different elements, similar to that in which the resultant in a parallelogram of forces stands to its components. For instance, in the content of one of my dreams, there was a question of an injection with propyl. To begin with, the analysis only led me to an indifferent experience which had acted as dream instigator, and in which a part was played by Amyl. I was not yet able to justify the confusion between Amyl and propyl. In the group of ideas behind this same dream, however, there was also a recollection of my first visit to Munich, where I had been struck by the propylia. The details of the analysis made it plausible to suppose that it was the influence of this second group of ideas upon the first one that was responsible for the displacement from amyl to propyl. Propyl is, as it were, an intermediate idea between amyl and propylia, and found its way into the content of the dream as a kind of compromise by means of simultaneous condensation and displacement. There is a still more urgent necessity in the case of the process of displacement than in that of condensation to discover the motive for these puzzling efforts on the part of the dream work. It is the process of displacement which is chiefly responsible for our being unable to discover or recognize the dream thoughts in the dream content unless we understand the reason for their distortion. Nevertheless, the dream thoughts are also submitted to another and milder sort of transformation, which leads to our discovering a new achievement on the part of the dream work. One, however, which is easily intelligible. The dream thoughts which we first come across as we proceed with our analysis often strike us by the unusual form in which they are expressed. They are not clothed in the prosaic language usually employed by our thoughts, but are on the contrary represented symbolically by means of similes and metaphors in images resembling those of poetic speech. There is no difficulty in accounting for the constraint imposed upon the form in which the dream thoughts are expressed. The manifest content of dreams consists for the most part in pictorial situations, and the dream thoughts must accordingly be submitted in the first place to a treatment which will make them suitable for a representation of this kind. If we imagine ourselves faced by the problem of representing the arguments in a political leading article, or the speeches of counsel before a court of law in a series of pictures, we shall easily understand the modifications which must necessarily be carried out by the dream work owing to considerations of representability in the content of the dream. The psychical material of the dream thoughts habitually includes recollections of impressive experiences, not infrequently dating back to early childhood, which are thus themselves perceived as a rule as situations having a visual subject matter. Wherever the possibility arises, this portion of the dream thoughts exercises a determining influence upon the form taken by the content of the dream. It constitutes, as it were, a nucleus of crystallization, attracting the material of the dream thoughts to itself and thus affecting their distribution. The situation in a dream is often nothing other than a modified repetition, complicated by interpolations, of an impressive experience of this kind. On the other hand, faithful and straightforward reproductions of real scenes only rarely appear in dreams. The content of dreams, however, does not consist entirely of situations, but also includes disconnected fragments of visual images, speeches, and even bits of unmodified thoughts. It may therefore perhaps be of interest to enumerate very briefly the modes of representation available to the dream work for reproducing the dream thoughts in the peculiar form of expression necessary in dreams. The dream thoughts which we arrive at by means of analysis reveal themselves as a psychical complex of the most intricate possible structure. Its portions stand in the most manifold logical relations to one another. They represent foreground and background, conditions, digressions and illustrations, chains of evidence and counter-arguments. Each train of thought is almost invariably accompanied by its contradictory counterpart. This material lacks none of the characteristics that are familiar to us from our waking thinking. If now all of this is to be turned into a dream, The psychical material will be submitted to a pressure which will condense it greatly, to an internal fragmentation and displacement, which will, as it were, create new surfaces, and to a selective operation in favor of those portions of it which are the most appropriate for the construction of situations. If we take into account the genesis of the material, a process of this sort deserves to be described as a regression. In the course of this transformation, however, the logical links which have hitherto held the psychical material together are lost. It is only, as it were, the substantive content of the dream thoughts that the dream work takes over and manipulates. The restoration of the connections which the dream work has destroyed is a task which has to be performed by the work of analysis. The modes of expression open to a dream may therefore be qualified as meager by comparison with those of our intellectual speech. Nevertheless, a dream need not wholly abandon the possibility of reproducing the logical relations present in the dream thoughts. On the contrary, it succeeds often enough in replacing them by formal characteristics in its own texture. In the first place, dreams take into account the connection which undeniably exists between all the portions of the dream thoughts by combining the whole material into a single situation. They reproduce logical connection by approximation in time and space, just as a painter will represent all the poets in a single group in a picture of Parnassus. It is true that they were never in fact assembled on a single mountaintop, but they certainly form a conceptual group. Dreams carry this method of reproduction down to details, and often when they show us two elements in the dream content close together, this indicates that there is some specially intimate connection between what correspond to them among the dream thoughts. Incidentally, it is to be observed that all dreams produced during a single night will be found on analysis to be derived from the same circle of thoughts. A causal relation between two thoughts is either left unrepresented or is replaced by a sequence of two pieces of dream of different lengths. Here the representation is often reversed, the beginning of the dream standing for the consequence and its conclusion for the premise. An immediate transformation of one thing into another in a dream seems to represent the relation of cause and effect. The alternative either or is never expressed in dreams, both of the alternatives being inserted in the text of the dream as though they were equally valid. I have already mentioned that an either or used in recording a dream is to be translated by and. Ideas which are contraries are by preference expressed in dreams by one and the same element. No seems not to exist so far as dreams are concerned. Opposition between two thoughts, the relation of reversal, may be represented in dreams in a most remarkable way. It may be represented by some other piece of the dream content being turned into its opposite, as it were by an afterthought. We shall hear presently of a further method of expressing contradiction. The sensation of inhibition of movement, which is so common in dreams, also serves to express a contradiction between two impulses, a conflict of will. One and one only of these logical relations, that of similarity, consonance, the possession of common attributes, is very highly favored by the mechanism of dream formation. The dream work makes use of such cases as a foundation for dream condensation, by bringing together everything that shows an agreement of this kind into a new unity. This short series of rough comments is of course inadequate to deal with the full extent of the formal means employed by dreams for the expression of logical relations in the dream thoughts. Different dreams are more or less carefully constructed in this respect. They keep more or less closely to the text presented to them. They make more or less use of the expedients that are open to the dream work. In the second case, they appear obscure, confused, and disconnected. If, however, a dream strikes one as obviously absurd, if its content includes a piece of palpable nonsense, this is intentionally so. Its apparent disregard of all the requirements of logic is expressing a piece of the intellectual content of the dream thoughts. Absurdity in a dream signifies the presence in the dream thoughts of contradiction, ridicule, and derision. Since this statement is in the most marked opposition to the view that dreams are the product of a dissociated and uncritical mental activity, I will emphasize it by means of an example. One of my acquaintances, Mr. M, had been attacked in an essay with an unjustifiable degree of violence, as we all thought, by no less a person than Goethe. Mr. M was naturally crushed by the attack. He complained of it bitterly to some company at table. His veneration for Goethe had not been affected, however, by this personal experience. I now tried to throw a little light on the chronological data, which seemed to me improbable. Goethe died in 1832. Since his attack on Herr M must naturally have been made earlier than that, Mr. M must have been quite a young man at the time. It seemed to be a plausible notion that he was 18. I was not quite sure, however, what year we were actually in, so that my whole calculation melted into obscurity. Incidentally, the attack was contained in Goethe's well-known essay on nature. The nonsensical character of this dream will be even more glaringly obvious if I explain that Herr M is a youngish businessman who is far removed from any poetical and literary interests. I have no doubt, however, that when I have entered into the analysis of the dream, I shall succeed in showing how much method there is in its nonsense. The material of the dream was derived from three sources. Firstly, Mr. M, whom I had got to know among some company at table, asked me one day to examine his elder brother, who was showing signs of general paralysis. In the course of my conversation with the patient, an awkward episode occurred, for he gave his brother away for no accountable reason by talking of his youthful follies. I had asked the patient the year of his birth, the year of Goethe's death in the dream, and had made him carry out a number of calculations in order to test the weakness of his memory. Second one, a medical journal, which bore my name among others on its title page, had published a positively crushing criticism by a youthful reviewer of a book by my friend F in Berlin. I took the editor to task over this, but though he expressed his regret, he would not undertake to offer any redress. I therefore severed my connection with the journal, but in my letter of resignation expressed a hope that our personal relations would not be affected by the event. This was the true source of the dream. The unfavorable reception of my friend's work had made a profound impression on me. It contained, in my opinion, a fundamental biological discovery, which is only now, many years later, beginning to find favor with the experts. And the third one, a woman patient of mine had given me an account a short time before of her brother's illness, and how he had broken out in a frenzy with cries of "Nature! Nature!" The doctors believed that his exclamation came from his having read Goethe's striking essay on that subject, and that it showed he had been overworking at his studies. I had remarked that it seemed to me more plausible that his exclamation of the word "nature" should be taken in the sexual sense in which it is used by the less educated people here. This idea of mine was at least not disproved by the fact that the unfortunate young man subsequently mutilated his own genitals. He was 18 at the time of his outbreak. Behind my own ego in the dream content, there lay concealed, in the first instance, my friend who had been so badly treated by the critic. I tried to throw a little light on the chronological data. My friend book dealt with the chronological data of life, and among other things, showed that the length of Goethe's life was a multiple of a number of days that has a significance in biology. But this ego was compared with a paralytic. I was not quite sure what year we were in. Thus the dream made out that my friend was behaving like a paralytic, and in this respect it was a mass of absurdities. The dream thoughts, however, were saying, ironically, naturally, it he, my friend F, who is the crazy fool, and it you, the critics, who are the men of genius and know better. Surely it couldn't be the reverse. There were plenty of examples of this reversal in the dream. For instance, Goethe attacked the young man, which is absurd, whereas it is still easy for quite a young man to attack the great Goethe. I should like to lay it down that no dream is prompted by motives other than egoistic ones. In fact, the ego in the present dream does not stand only for my friend, but for myself as well. I was identifying myself with him because the fate of his discovery seemed to foreshadow the reception of my own findings. If I were to bring forward my theory emphasizing the part played by sexuality in the etiology of psychoneurotic disorders, the allusion to the 18-year-old patient cry of "nature, nature," I should come across the same criticisms, and I was already preparing to meet them with the same derision. If we pursue the dream thoughts further, we shall keep on finding ridicule and derision as correlates of the absurdities of the manifest dream. It is well known that it was the discovery of the split skull of a sheep on the Lido of Venice that gave Goethe the idea of the so-called vertebral theory of the skull. My friend boasts that, when he was a student, he released a storm which led to the resignation of an old professor, who, though he had once been distinguished, among other things in connection precisely with the same branch of comparative anatomy, had become incapable of teaching owing to senile dementia. Thus, the agitation which my friend promoted served to combat the mischievous system according to which there is no age limit for academic workers in German universities, for age is proverbially no defense against folly. In the hospital here, I had the honor of serving for years under a chief who had long been a fossil and had for decades been notoriously feeble-minded, but who was allowed to continue carrying on his responsible duties. At this point, I thought of a descriptive term based upon the discovery on the Lido.